The Single Dad and the Career Girl by M.K. Connor. About the book. Is co-parenting the solution for an ambitious career girl and a lonely widower? Love isn't part of the deal until a baby born with special needs pulls them together, despite their very best efforts to keep their hearts out of it. I hope you enjoy this story as Sasha, Jude, and baby Noah create their own unique family and discover that while life rarely goes according to plan, the unexpected sometimes surpasses our greatest hopes and expectations. Chapter 1. 1 year earlier, Sasha Alexander's commute from her luxury high-rise apartment to her corporate office suite, which was a 10-minute walk from one tower to the other in a mixed-use complex situated in the center of Arlington, Virginia. On September mornings like this, when the wind was gusting sheets of rain against the huge glass panes enclosing the plaza that connected the residential and office towers, she was especially grateful she'd chosen the convenience of living so near to where she worked. Virtually everything she needed, fitness center, restaurants, and shops, was offered in the live, work, play complex. It even boasted a landscaped outdoor space where folks meet up for yoga, farmers markets, and other community events. For the past 4 years, it had been the perfect solution for an ambitious young woman focused on launching a successful career. However, she wasn't sure it was where she wanted to raise a child. As she crossed the marble-tiled lobby toward the bank of elevators that would take her to her office on the 28th floor, she flipped through random memories of the house where she'd grown up. The $12 million historical Georgetown mansion was her father's showplace. Its stark but impressive decor had been featured on the pages of architectural and lifestyle magazines, but it lacked the warmth needed to make it a home. Business titans, foreign heads of state, and celebrities were frequent guests of Stedman Alexander, a self-made manufacturing millionaire who was more interested in building an empire than raising his daughter. On the rare occasions he ventured to her room or they sat down for a meal together, the conversation was stilted. He asked about academics but never about her thoughts or feelings or emotions. Her mother, a quiet, nurturing woman, had always been the bridge between them, and when she died in a car accident when Sasha was 12, it left a chasm that became wider over time. At first, she tried desperately to win her father's approval by excelling in school and sports. While her father remained oblivious to her efforts, her super-competitive attitude made the other teens resent her. She soon decided friendship and relationships were overrated, so she focused on what was important to her. Now, at 29, she'd earned a master's in environmental engineering and, after a tense confrontation with her father about his corporation's lack of green practices, convinced him to create a new position for her in the company. Her job as Director of Environmental Health and Safety required long hours, extensive travel, and innovative thinking to develop sustainable practices. She'd poured her heart and soul into her career for more than 10 years, but suddenly, it wasn't enough. She felt a longing for something more, something truly meaningful, like a child. At 7 a.m., traffic to the tower offices was light. She rode up in the elevator alone, thoughts torn between the distant relationship with her father and the demands of a new corporate-wide policy rollout that was meeting resistance. Some of her inner turmoil abated when she entered her office, the plaque with her name and title a reminder of how much she'd accomplished. She pushed the memories away and focused her attention on the present. Setting her Louis Vuitton briefcase on the edge of her desk, she shrugged out of her raincoat and programmed her espresso machine for a double shot. She inhaled the rich aroma as she hung up the coat and returned to her desk. Bumping the executive chair out of her way with a hip, she began sorting through the neat stack of folders and mail her executive assistant had prepared. Starting her day with 30 minutes of peace and quiet was one of the few traditions inherited from her father. She appreciated the clarity it afforded, as well as the guaranteed opportunity every single day to claim at least half an hour for herself. She wandered over to retrieve the steaming espresso, scanning the panoramic view of Washington, D.C., Virginia, and Maryland, many of the familiar landmarks lost in the overcast murk, then sat down to skim the Wall Street Journal. A few pages in, a headline caught her attention. Romance not required, when virtual strangers parent together. As she delved into the text, a fluttery sensation filled her stomach. More and more men and women are waiting to have children and start a family, a decision that sometimes creates unexpected challenges. 90 minutes later, James, Sasha's executive assistant, knocked on the doorframe and peeked through the half-open door. "Hey, boss, are you aware the team meeting started 10 minutes ago?" Reluctantly dragging her attention away from the co-parenting website she'd been scrolling through, Sasha glanced at the wall clock and realized she'd lost track of time. Her espresso sat off to one side, now cold and unappealing. "Is co-parenting an option for you?" The text on the computer screen reeled her in like a fish caught on a line. For the first time in months, Sasha felt the giddy pulse of anticipation. She wanted to know more about this very unusual concept, and a crazy sense of urgency overrode everything else, including the 6 members of her team waiting in the conference room down the hall. "Ask Stephanie to lead the meeting," she said. "Something's come up." She intentionally avoided James's expression, not wanting to answer the questions her uncharacteristic behavior would surely spark. "Clear my calendar," she added, softening her tone with an unspoken apology for the inconvenience her last-minute decision would cause. "I'll probably be tied up with this for the rest of the day." Jude Scott absent-mindedly raised his coffee mug to his mouth, eyes fixed on the screen of his cell phone. He tilted the mug higher, expecting to taste the dark brew he favored, before realizing the cup was empty. He grunted, reaching behind him to set the plain red mug on the kitchen counter as he reread the article that perked up his attention more effectively than the second cup of caffeine. The explosive shatter as ceramic mug hit stone tile finally kicked him into the present and out of his preoccupied fixation on the news article his sister had sent him. "Romance not required, when virtual strangers parent together." After reading the opening sentence, his first reaction was to scoff at the idea of 2 strangers raising a child together. Parenting was a full-time commitment that required equal participation from the mother and the father. Sure, kids grew up without one or the other for various reasons, but he'd seen the hurt and betrayal carried into adulthood by youngsters, especially young men, who grew up without benefit of 2 parents. As much as he wanted a child of his own, marriage simply wasn't an option. 4 years after the swift and sudden loss of his wife to a subarachnoid hemorrhage, he still grieved. He was still in love with Laura. He couldn't fathom loving another woman, touching another woman, creating a child with another woman. Laura's passing wasn't the only thing he mourned. It was the loss of their hopes and plans for the future. Dreams that included children. Lots and lots of children. Some with his thick, brown hair and hazel eyes. Some with Laura's black spiraling curls and wide blue eyes. They'd dreamed of a future that unfurled 1 year at a time until they were old and gray, confined to side-by-side rocking chairs on the porch of the farmhouse outside Chantilly, Virginia, he'd inherited from his grandfather. Their future ended before it had even started. Jude's chest constricted as it typically did when he thought about his wife. He closed his eyes and waited for the heartache to ease, astonishment replacing the ache when some part of him realized the razor-sharp edges seemed blunted. He squeezed his eyes tighter, clutching the pain, refusing to let it go until he'd suffered enough to prove his love and sorrow was every bit as fierce today as it had been that day 4 years ago when Laura dropped dead in the grocery store dairy aisle. Although he scoffed at the headline, He'd continued reading the article with the same morbid fascination that prompted people to slow down and gawk at a grisly traffic accident. The more he read, the less foolish and more practical the idea became. The appeal of co-parenting is the flexibility it offers participants. The relationship can be romantic or platonic. Individuals may be single, divorced, straight, gay, or some combination thereof. When two people decide to raise a child together without being married, a co-parenting contract serves as a guide and agreement as to how the child will be raised while protecting the interest of both partners. Jude tucked his cell phone in his back pocket and bent to pick up the coffee mug shards. He dumped them in the trash, then swiped a paper towel over the tile where a few drops of coffee had splattered. His mind raced with crazy possibilities. He'd never considered having a child on his own. There was no way he would intentionally bring a baby into the world without doing his best to ensure the child grew up with two parents. Knowing he'd never remarry, he'd written off any prospect of becoming a father. But what if? He grunted again, convinced there was zero chance of finding a woman who shared his values, parenting style, beliefs, traditions, and so forth, and who would agree to a platonic co-parenting relationship. Most women wanted the whole package and were unwilling to settle for less. His cell began playing We Are Family, the pop song by Sister Sledge he'd assigned as the ringtone for his siblings. Since Janice was the one who'd texted him the co-parenting article 20 minutes ago, that was probably her calling. So what do you think? His sister's cheerful voice was an octave higher and 2 beats faster than usual, conveying her excitement. I think you're butting in where you don't belong, he told her. The Scott family was notorious for ignoring personal boundaries. Laura would be furious if she knew you were wasting your life like this, Janice said, her chirpy tone shifting to disapproval. She'd tell you the pity party is over, and it's time to move on. Like I said, sis, you're butting in where you don't belong. His own tone cooled, and he put the call on speakerphone, setting the device on the counter as if to put space between him and Janice. I'm sorry. She was instantly contrite, the timbre of her voice altering yet again. The constant shift of her vocal inflections reminded Jude of the wax bolus in lava lamps that continually morphed from one shape to another. You know, we just want you to be happy. Happy was a state of being Jude held little hope of ever achieving again. None of his siblings had lost a spouse or child, or even a best friend. Sure, they'd lost grandparents and elderly aunts and uncles, but none of them had a clue what it felt like to lose someone so close to you that they felt like an extension of your own body and soul. When Laura passed away, a part of him died too. There was no way to explain what it felt like to wake up each day, missing a part of yourself and knowing you'd never regain it. It was easier to accept their well-meaning sympathy than try to put it into words. I know that. He stared out the window over the sink, letting the soggy September morning distract him so he didn't lash out. For some reason, he was suddenly angry at the hopefulness that rose up when he'd read the article. I know how much you wanted kids, she said softly. Laura told us over and over one of the things she loved most about you was what a great father you were going to make. It's just so sad to think that will never happen. Never say never. The random thought startled him, and his spine straightened as if he'd been poked by a sharp stick. Never say never. That had been one of his wife's favorite sayings when he groused about how impossible something seemed. Think about it. Janice paused for a moment, then added, will we see you for Pete's birthday? We're meeting at Brew and Pie for dinner. His siblings and parents might drive him crazy, but they were family. That was reason enough to make an effort to at least appear to be happy. I'll be there, just like he was there for his other siblings' birthdays, holidays, picnics, graduations, pool parties, and all the other occasions his large family celebrated. Awesome. Gotta go. Right before Jude disconnected, He heard his sister shout to get the final word. Just think about it. Chapter 2. Hello, Jude. Zoe Hernandez, the marriage and family therapist he and Sasha Alexander had been seeing for the past year, invited him into her office with a broad smile that revealed white, even teeth. Sasha isn't here yet. I'm early, and she texted to let me know she's running late. You're always early, Zoe said, pushing her silky black hair behind her ears. I'm going to check my email real fast while we wait for her. Not a problem. Tugging at the knees of his khakis, Jude lowered himself into one of the comfortable chairs arranged in a quartet across the room from the therapist's desk. The room was decorated in a palette of soothing colors: pale ocean blue walls, oak wooden floor, nubby beige fabric on the chairs, and a gray shaggy area rug. Vibrant artwork reflected the therapist's Latino heritage, as did a variety of brightly painted ceramics arranged around the office. He gazed around the space, aware how much he'd changed since his first appointment 12 months ago. He'd been so anxious and uncertain. The more he learned about co-parenting, the more he wondered if it could possibly work. The idea of having a baby with a stranger was off the charts crazy, but Zoe had gently guided them through the process and brought them to today, their final appointment before the arrival of Noah Alexander Scott. He grinned, remembering how big Zima, their surrogate, was getting, how hard and round and tight her belly was, and how it felt to lay his hand on her warm skin and feel the baby move. You must be thinking about your son, Zoe commented, slipping into one of the other chairs, her dark eyes fixed on his. You've come a long way, Jude. 12 months ago, I wondered if you'd ever smile again. Some days are still hard, he admitted. My sister and Mom went with me to pick out stuff for the nursery, and I kept thinking Laura should be there. How did that make you feel? Zoe asked. Angry, sad, powerless. His throat tightened. Guilty. We've talked about this before, she reminded him. I know. I'm getting better at looking forward instead of focusing on the past and things I can't change. He smoothed his hands down his thighs. But, Zoe prompted, as I experience each milestone: the positive pregnancy test, hearing the baby's heartbeat, deciding on a name, decorating the nursery, I think about Laura. I was supposed to share these moments with her. Supposed to is just as dangerous as should and must. Absolutes like these lock a person into black and white thinking. There's no room for negotiation. It's win or lose, pass or fail. She crossed her legs and leaned back in her chair as if they were discussing the weather instead of the anguish overshadowing the joy of impending fatherhood. It's not easy to reconcile the loss of a loved one. Feeling powerless to change the situation is one of the most difficult aspects of grief. But I'm not powerless, he finished for her. Learning to reframe my thoughts and feelings has been helpful. But sometimes he didn't need to elaborate. They'd covered this topic numerous times in his private sessions with the therapist. Give me an example of something you've referenced. He thought of the rambunctious puppy waiting for him at home and felt his mouth turn up even as tears burned the back of his eyes. Would there ever come a day when he reacted with a single emotion instead of a messy contradiction that tugged his heart in different directions? Laura always said a family wasn't complete without a dog. He exhaled, easing some of the tension coiling around his spine. She wanted to wait until we had kids so they could grow up with together. Zoe smiled encouragingly. I take it Noah has a buddy waiting for him? I just brought home an 8-week-old golden retriever. He shook his head ruefully and chuckled. I'm glad we have 6 weeks or so before the baby arrives. We still have so much to do before we bring him home. Zoe's elegantly arched brow rose. What? Confused by her reaction, Jude thought back over what he'd just said. When we bring him home. Jude shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Something wrong with that? Not at all. Her gaze was forthright, assessing, knowing. We've talked at length about boundaries and roles and expectations. Respecting the parameters of your relationship with Sasha is critical for successful co-parenting. What are you saying? Jude bristled, intuiting where the conversation was headed. I just told you I'm still not over Laura, and now it sounds like you're accusing me of I'm not accusing you of anything. She ignored his defensive response, her warm, even tone unchanged. You and Sasha are facing a huge transition. Although you've been working on your co-parenting relationship for almost a year, much of what we've talked about has been in theory. The moment Noah is born, you put your agreement into practice. There's potential for conflict, which is why we spend so much time on communication and negotiating skills. Each of you has a vision of how platonic co-parenting will work, how it will feel, how the other person will behave, how friends and family will respond. Reality is often much different and much harder. That's why co-parents are encouraged to continue working with a therapist for at least the first year. Sasha and I have agreed to keep seeing you, he reminded her. I'm not criticizing you, Jude. Zoe's gaze flicked away for just a second, and she hesitated before continuing. His hair on his arms rose, and he wasn't sure he wanted to hear what else she had to say. I've seen some platonic co-parenting relationships evolve into something more intimate, she said slowly. Some couples fall in love after they have a child together. They go on to get married, have more children, and live happily ever after. In some cases, though, having a baby blurs the lines. They fall in love with the idea of having a romantic partner and creating a traditional family. In a few months, sometimes as long as a few years, they realize they were in love with the notion and not each other. Jude leaned back and folded his arms over his chest, heat rising from his belly to his hairline. I will never. He exhaled heavily. Ever love another woman. Laura was, is, and always will be the love of my life. Sasha stood outside her therapist's office, unwilling to interrupt the conversation between Zoe and Jude. They'd talked his deceased wife in several sessions, so it wasn't that the topic was off limits. It was that she'd never heard him speak so passionately about her. His voice practically vibrated with the intensity of his emotions, the conviction stopping her in her tracks as if she'd run into a thick steel door. She knew the loss of his young wife had devastated him, but overhearing his tremulous words made her feel as if she were standing beside him in a sandstorm that flayed the skin from your bones, leaving you raw and ravaged. Her breath caught in her throat. She'd never been in love. Lust, yes, and even a few cases of college student-professor infatuation that never went anywhere. But she'd never come close anything remotely resembling the adoration Jude still carried for his wife. A hot burst of envy flared in Sasha's belly. Jude described his marriage to Laura as idyllic. He and Laura met in college, got married, and were just about to starting their family when she tragically died. Laura was perfect. Everyone loved Laura still, especially Jude. Dear God, why did some part of her want to sneer when she said the woman's name? Sasha had no desire to complicate her life with something as messy as marriage. Her father proved that some men serve their interests first, foremost, forever. When her mother died, her father was nowhere to be found. It was a pattern that never changed, so she'd learn to deal with it. Look for it. Be ready for it. Expect it. That didn't negate the importance of raising a child with two loving parents. Mothers and fathers served different roles in a child's life. She wanted to ensure that her baby's father was fully committed to his paternal duties, privileges, and responsibilities. No reason to muck it up with a romantic relationship that could go south any time, leaving her and the kid on their own. No, She wanted a man who wanted to be a dad and nothing else. Jude fit the bill perfectly. She'd waded through more than 100 candidates before landing on his profile. Of course, the initial file contained no identifying information like a name or photograph. It provided background information such as health and family histories, physical attributes like hair and eye color, and a psychological assessment that highlighted personality and behavioral traits. What had been most compelling was his personal inventory that detailed values and beliefs, as well as the characteristics he wanted in a co-parent. He'd also written a letter to potential co-parents, revealing his status as a widower and the non-negotiable requirement that the relationship remain platonic. He was everything Sasha wanted in a father for her child. So why was she jealous of Laura? Maybe she was just being territorial. She and Jude were about to become parents of a beautiful baby boy, but when he brought up his dead wife, it felt like the three of them were having a baby. Zoe would remind her of the importance of boundaries. That part of the co-parenting agreement was respecting the other person's limits, that assumptions doomed any hope of success, and to accept decisions as fluid, requiring continuous compromise. Co-parenting, said Zoe, was a delicate balance between consistency and flexibility. Thinking about motherhood in such terms made Sasha's head hurt. Before she and Jude committed to having a child together, they'd spent hours and hours with Zoe, who counseled them on the practicalities, realities, possibilities, and contingencies of co-parenting. Part of the process was spending time together, learning about each other. It was like dating, except the outcome wasn't to end up in bed together or fall in love. It was about determining compatibility as partners in a platonic parenting relationship. Sasha stifled laughter as her thoughts meandered to this ironic conclusion. Most people assessed potential partners for their own needs. She'd evaluated Jude on a whole different scale and gave him high marks in all the categories that mattered. He was reliable, fair, mature, generous, stable, open-minded, caring, patient, and loyal. Damn, was he loyal, especially to Laura. Sasha should be here by now. Why don't you text her and see if she's close? The therapist's concerned voice reminded Sasha she was supposed to be part of the dialogue, not eavesdropping on it. Hi, guys. She breezed into the office, closing the door behind her, and giving Jude a brief nod. Sorry I'm late. What did I miss? Laura, since this is our last session before the big day, let's talk about the birth plan and coming home plan. Zoe waited for Sasha to take off her coat and get comfortable in the chair next to Jude. She angled her body towards Jude, as he did the same. Go ahead, he said. You have more happening than I do. I'm just working on housebreaking a new puppy. He smirked, his close-cropped beard framing his appealing smile. Sasha relaxed, sliding into her corporate demeanor. This was what she excelled at, looking at a challenge from all angles, weighing the pros and cons, thinking outside the box to find the optimal solution, and then designing and executing an action plan. She had the transition from single career woman to single career mother organized down to the smallest detail. Jude and I agreed that Noah will come home from the hospital with me. We'll immediately begin the weekly rotation, 1 week with mommy, 1 week with daddy. We'll consider visitation on the other parent's time for the first 3 months because an unexpected sob interrupted her recitation. Jude reached for her hand, then pulled his arm back. She blinked back, happy tears that suddenly burned with something else. Zoe handed her a box of tissues. This is a momentous occasion for both of you. It's not unusual for emotions to be all over the place. Sasha stiffened her spine and forced a smile. I wish I could have carried the baby myself, but Dr. Anderson said my congenital uterine anomaly made it too risky. At least Noah has both of our genes, so technically, we are both his biological parents. Zima has been fantastic about including us in the pregnancy, and we're both going to be there for the birth. Even though I've felt Noah move and seen the ultrasound pictures, it won't seem real until I hold him." Jude nodded what she said. The three shared a laugh. Then Zoe continued, eyes on Sasha. "How is the move going?" She grimaced. 10 days behind schedule. It's going to be close, but my interior designer and her crew promised everything will be in place by mid-October. Hopefully. That gives me 2 weeks to settle in. Are you taking time off of work? I've scheduled myself off every other week, starting November 1st, through the new year. I've hired an assistant director for my department, who starts next week. She'll be taking over most of the travel. Work-life balance is my top priority right now. She looked at Jude, inviting him to join the conversation. "I work from home." He shrugged. "I've finished all of my commissions, just need to ship them out next week. Like Sasha, I cleared my schedule through the end of the year. When it's her week with Noah, I plan to work on some of my own stained glass designs. There's an art gallery in Alexandria that's been after me to set up a show. It will be a nice change from my commercial pieces." "We're ready," Sasha said. Zoe reached out, clasping one hand around Jude's fingers and the other around Sasha's. "Congratulations. You've both worked hard to prepare yourselves to become a mother and a father. Noah is a lucky boy." Impulsively, Sasha linked her fingers with Jude's and squeezed. "We're the lucky ones." Chapter 3. This is weird. Jude resisted the temptation to frown at his sister, keeping a fake smile plastered on his face. "What's weird is your family planning a surprise baby shower at a bar and inviting the baby's mother without asking the baby's father," he muttered. "She's the baby mama," Janice hissed, her words thankfully drowned out by the loud rock music that reached into every nook and cranny of Brew and Pie. "It would be even weirder if she wasn't here. I've explained our arrangement to you several times," he said, losing another ounce of patience every time a new guest walked through the door bearing a card or gift. His entire family was there, including his maternal grandparents, 11 cousins, and several employees who worked at the hardware store his father owned. Janice watched Sasha, who was on the other side of the pizzeria, surrounded by friendly but overbearing members of the Scott family. "I know, but I still don't understand why we shouldn't have included her in the baby shower for her son." "Boundaries," he said for the 100th, or maybe it was the 500th, time. "You sound like a broken record," she complained. "This is really about family. Since Sasha is the mother of your child, that makes her family." Jude's mood darkened another degree. It had been 3 days since their last appointment with Zoe, and now that they were in the final countdown to making this real, he was having second thoughts. Not second thoughts about fatherhood. God, he couldn't wait to hold his son, to finally look into those newborn eyes and see if they were green flecked with brown like his or Sasha's gray-green. Scott babies typically arrived with a thick shock of hair that spiked in all directions, but maybe Noah would have his mother's silky blonde hair. It didn't matter whose eyes or hair he had. The most important thing was that he be strong and healthy. Jude was having second thoughts about the whole co-parenting arrangement. It was easy to lecture Janice and the rest of his family about boundaries, but practicing what he preached was much harder. Zoe had prepared them, educated them, coached them, and counseled them. She cautioned about potential problems and armed them with tools for conflict resolution. He and Sasha had negotiated living arrangements, holidays, time-sharing, child-rearing and discipline, funding for college, and damn, he was getting sick of the word boundaries. Hard and soft limits, deal breakers, and issues that mattered more to one than the other. On paper, it sounded great. In real life, it was complicated. Parenting was a full-time job, and they were treating it like shared office space. The split time schedule meant Noah would be handed off like a baton in a relay race every Friday afternoon and Sunday evening for the next 18 years. According to Zoe, Co-parenting was becoming more and more commonplace. Divorced parents had been co-parenting or, in extreme cases where limited contact between the parents was required, parallel parenting for decades. Social and cultural norms were changing to accommodate non-traditional family structures like children raised by grandparents, blended families, same-sex couples, or polyamorous unions. The idea of two adults who wanted a child but not marriage wasn't that radical. Two parents were optimal. Studies showed that children raised by two loving, committed parents achieved higher academic success, displayed fewer behavioral issues, and experienced better mental and physical health. Sure, lots of kids brought up by single parents made it to adulthood just fine and went on to live happy, productive lives. Growing up in a traditional family was no guarantee a kid wouldn't end up on drugs, in jail, or dropping out of school. But boys who grew up without a strong father figure were at increased risk for all of the above. He knew firsthand what could happen when a kid grew up in a broken home. His high school pal Alan was a perfect example. Alan's mom worked 3 jobs to provide a home for him and his sister. Without adult supervision, without a parent who spent time with him, Alan was selling crack by the time he was 15. He started using meth a few years later. He was homeless, living on the streets, body and mind ravaged by drugs when someone stabbed him to death. His best friend died for $20 worth of crystal meth. Co-parenting decreased the odds of something like that happening, especially for a kid like Noah who was going to grow up with a beautiful, intelligent, ambitious mother and a creative, dedicated, decent-looking father. Right after he left the appointment with Zoe, something started nagging at him like a half-remembered dream. When he'd walked into Brunt Pie and caught sight of Sasha, it hit him. How were they supposed to put boundaries on the most precious, most intimate, most important thing in their lives? Is this how's it going to be for the foreseeable future? Janice asked. You on one side, Sasha on the other, and Noah in the middle. We'll work it out, he said, not sure he believed his own words. He glared down at his sister. Why all the questions? You're the one who encouraged me to consider co-parenting. Her brows dipped, the vertical line between them almost an exclamation point on his statement. His stomach churned until he noted the genuine concern in Janice's eyes. Maybe this wasn't such a great idea, she whispered. I didn't know it would be like this. He sighed and slung his arm over his sister's shoulders. Don't worry about it. Sasha and I are committed to figuring this out. This only thing that matters is what's best for Noah. You look like you need a beer. Pete, the oldest of the Scott siblings, shoved an icy bottle at Jude. He nodded toward Sasha, appreciative eyes wandering over her long hair and curvy figure. She's hot. For the life of me, I can't figure out why you didn't go the regular route to baby making. Don't be crass, Janice said, poking her index finger in her older brother's chest. You're also being disrespectful. That woman is the mother of your nephew. Pete shook his head, a bemused expression on the broad planes of his face. Twice divorced and clueless as to why his marriages kept failing, he was the kind of guy who valued the size of a woman's breasts and ass more than her personality. Fortunately, his stunted emotional intelligence was an outlier compared to the rest of the family. Where's your babe of the week? Janice craned her neck to scan the pizzeria. Platinum blonde, right sweater 3 sizes too small, painted on jeans. There she is. She nudged Pete with her elbow. She's by the pinball machine, talking to Seth. Shit. Pete strode off to claim his girlfriend before the joint's notoriously sexy bartender convinced her to step into the back room with him. I'm so glad I don't have to deal with that, Jude said, watching his brother swagger like a guy 20 years younger. He doubted Pete would ever outgrow his juvenile perspective on women and relationships. What a relief. Janice's sarcasm rang loud and clear. It's going to be so much easier raising your son with a woman who has boundaries. I'm supposed to be having fun, he reminded her. This is my special day. Quit raining on my parade. Let's hope one of those packages contains an umbrella, she shot back. I think you're in for one heck of a squall. Fed up with his sister's pessimistic attitude, Jude wandered through the throng, nodding when people offered congratulations, jaw muscles burning from the effort to smile. He slid up to Sasha, careful to keep space between them. The panicked look in her eyes shifted to relief. She kept nodding as his mother rattled off anecdotes about his childhood. He always hated wearing shoes, Mona Scott said, laughing. Even in winter, he'd get to school and take off his boots and socks and walk around barefoot. Do you remember that, honey? Yeah, Mom. His mirth was forced. He still hates shoes. His mother leaned in as if sharing a conspiratorial secret with Sasha. But at least he has nice feet. She turned to Jude. You got my feet. High arches and elegant toes. Your father's feet look like hooves. She shuddered. Jude wanted to roll his eyes. His mother was notorious for oversharing. It was nice of Sasha to have accepted his sister's invitation to the baby shower, but she'd not signed up for the Scott third degree or embarrassing family stories. Mom, Janice is looking for you. She needs your help with the cake or the gifts or something. Jude curved a hand under Sasha's elbow and wheeled them away from the crowd. She scooted into an empty booth at the back of the pizzeria, and he followed. I'm sorry, he said. I didn't know my family invited you. They don't quite understand our arrangement. Don't worry about it. She looked around the room, lips tilting up as she took in the noise and laughter. I'll admit that I was curious about your family. This gave me an excuse to finally meet them. Maybe you should have asked first. Jude squirmed, uncomfortable with Sasha's entree into his family circle. It normalized their relationship and brought her too close for comfort. Laura had been a part of his family. Sasha was. He didn't know what Sasha was. Zoe would say this is a boundary issue. She pulled back as if he'd struck her, the friendly, open expression on her face shuddering. I'll leave now. She clutched her purse, but he blocked her exit from the booth. This was the first time they'd experienced conflict of any sort, and Jude wasn't sure where to go or what to do. Their son was due in 6 weeks, and this was not a good way to start things off. Stay. He glanced around, aware of the curious looks directed their way. He waited for her defiant posture to relax. It's not that I don't want you here. I'm just not prepared for it. On some level, I knew you'd have to meet my family sooner or later, but I assumed it would be later. A young waitress in a black Bruin pie t-shirt came over and set 2 shot glasses filled with amber liquid on the table. A toast to the new parents. Around the pizzeria, friends and family held shot glasses aloft. A chorus of hoots, hollers, and shouts of congratulations echoed off the walls. He and Sasha raised their glasses, clinked them together, and tossed back the whiskey. I'll take your family over mine any day, she said. I didn't need to hear about your feet, but it's obvious they love you. Relationships. She accepted a second shot from the waitress. All relationships are messy, but when your heart is in the right place, it all works out. His shoulders dropped as some of the tension accumulated over the past 3 days eased. Before he could share another toast with her, both of their cell phones chimed. They exchanged a look. That's weird, she said, tugging her iPhone from a side pocket on her purse. He pulled out his cell and tapped the screen to read the incoming text. Oh no. Sasha's gasp echoed his own panicked reaction. Come on. He shot out of the booth. We have to go now. Chapter 4. How Zima. Sasha looked up from the incubator where Noah lay asleep. Physically, she's fine. Jude leaned over the chair where she sat, his voice a shaky whisper amid the beeping, chirping electronic equipment needed to protect these tiny, fragile lives. She couldn't stop crying and kept apologizing. The doctor said it wasn't her fault. She yawned and stretched, so tempted to lean back into Jude's warm strength. He said sometimes babies come early and you never know why. At almost 35 weeks, Noah was classified as a late preterm baby. He weighed 5 pounds and measured 20 inches in length. His arms and legs were thin, but he looked like a full-term infant. Although he would require a stay in the NICU neonatal intensive care unit, the outlook was encouraging. "How's he doing?" The leads and wires connected to his tiny body were intimidating until one of the nurses explained their purpose. The chest leads tracked his heart rate and breathing. A pulse ox taped to his toes measured the oxygen levels in his blood. A probe affixed with the patch recorded his body temperature. Tubes in his nose delivered oxygen to help him breathe, and N4 was in place for medicine and fluids. A thin feeding tube was taped to his cheek to make sure he got sufficient nutrition. The nurse just checked him a few minutes ago. Sasha blinked away tears. "He's stable, but it will probably be a few days until we can hold him." Jude rested his hands on her shoulders, the hesitant touch reassuring. "We've been here for hours. You must be exhausted. Let me take you home." She looked at the tiny hand curled around her index finger, her heart swelling with love and fear and amazement. Wearing only a diaper, a blue knit cap covering his thatch of dark hair, skin pink and splotchy, he was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. There was no way she could leave him. Not now. Not every other Friday when it was Jude's turn to parent their son. The thought of being separated from Noah, even knowing he'd be in good, gentle, capable hands, agonized her. Jude was kneeling at her side before she realized she was sobbing. She buried her face in her hands, unable to stem the shudders that racked her body while he rubbed her back and murmured reassurances. He was so kind, so patient, so genuinely caring and concerned that guilt added to her misery. If he knew what she was thinking, he'd be a whole lot less sympathetic. They'd signed an agreement to co-parent Noah equally, to split the costs, to share time, to be involved on a 50-50 basis. Equal rights, equal responsibilities, equal privileges. Seeing Noah, counting his tiny fingers and toes, hearing his first screechy cry changed everything. She'd fallen in love for the first time in her life. She'd only known Jude a year, but it was long enough to know he'd never give up his son. There was no sum of money or argument strong enough to convince him that a son belonged with his mother 100% of the time. She knew it was selfish. She knew Noah needed and deserved a father. She knew Jude was entitled to be a part of his son's life, but she never anticipated feeling like this. Like walking away, even for a few hours sleep and a hot shower, would feel like someone was ripping off her arm. Kitty, one of the NICU nurses, came over. "Everything okay?" She tried explaining but just sputtered a few sounds before weeping again. Jude stood up but kept one hand on her shoulder. "I offered to take her home, and she started crying. We've been here since last night. Can't leave," she choked out. "Mama's tired," Kitty said soothingly. "We have private rooms so you can stay here with your new baby. There's a comfortable recliner, a couch, a TV, a refrigerator and a sink. You can freshen up, get a nap, and remain nearby. If anything happens, we'll come get you immediately." A torrent of relief washed over Sasha. "Really?" "Yes. Follow me, and I'll get you set up." Kitty turned to Jude. "Will you be staying as well, Daddy?" Emotions played across Jude's face as he made his decision. "No, I need to get home, at least for a few hours. I'll come along to make sure Sasha is settled, and then head out." They followed the nurse down a short hallway. She showed them into a small but comfortable room, pointed out the amenities, and encouraged Sasha to hang up the "Do Not Disturb" sign so she could get some sleep. When she left, Sasha sank onto the edge of the sofa, her entire body weighted down with fatigue. When one of the nurses texted that Zima had gone into early labor and her water had broken, she and Jude climbed into his SUV and sped to the hospital, leaving their baby shower guests to finish the party without them. The next few hours passed in a blur as Noah was evaluated and stabilized in the NICU. She and Jude paced outside the nursery, desperate to see their son and reassure themselves he was okay. They sat with him for a while before Jude went to check on Zima. Sasha didn't even know what time it was. The sky was still dark, but dawn had to be close. I hope this isn't an indicator of what life with a baby is going to be like, Jude said, obviously trying to lighten the mood. Things definitely aren't going according to plan. She leaned back and stretched out, already drifting towards oblivion. Do you want me to bring back a toothbrush and, some personal stuff? Jude lingered at the door. Janice probably has something that would fit if you want a change of clothes. Would it be too big an imposition to ask you to pick up a few things from my apartment? I know it's out of the way, but I'm happy to do it. Make a list and text it to me. I'll need your keys. Sasha fumbled in her purse. You have the address? Yes. He took the key ring, their fingers brushing in a light caress that jolted her out of her woozy state. I'll be back about noon. Get some rest. He was through the door before she could thank him. 15 minutes later, she was still struggling to fall asleep. Jude sat behind the wheel of his SUV in the hospital parking lot. He'd been awake all night, riding an emotional roller coaster that took him from one extreme to another. Noah was 5 weeks premature, but he was doing well. He and Sasha stood on opposite sides of a boundary, but that boundary had been crossed, recrossed, and crossed again. First, when she showed up at the surprise baby shower. Next, when he touched her. Now, as his emotions muddled into a complex mix of something he didn't want to label. It's just a reaction to the crisis, he said aloud. A one-time thing that won't happen again. He was confusing his apprehension about the baby with concern for Sasha. It was okay to be concerned, but not concerned. Not the kind of concern that make his gut churn with fear and then flutter with pleasure when his touch seemed to soothe her. Not that kind of concern that eased when the stress lines vanished from her face and her eyes lit up with relief. That was definitely a boundary violation. He reminded himself that they were in this parenting thing together, and there would be times the boundaries weren't clear. He'd be sharing the rest of his life and his child with Sasha. It would be easier on Noah, especially when he got older, if they learned to be comfortable with each other. They were co-parenting, not parallel parenting. If it were the latter, there would be zero overlap. Parallel parenting required minimal direct contact and was used in cases where parents were unable to engage civilly. It had been an option, one both he and Sasha rejected. He closed his eyes and rested his forehead on the steering wheel. Every ounce of energy wrung out of him. He'd run by Sasha's apartment, pick up her things, and then head home. He needed some space and time to get his head screwed back on straight. Starting the engine, he dialed Janice to check on the puppy and give her an update on Noah. Oh my God, we've been waiting forever to hear something, she gushed into his ear as soon as the call connected. How is he? Who does he look like? Is he all right? When can we see him? He laughed, the sound genuinely joyful as Janice's fervent declarations reminded him he had a huge, loving, supportive family to help him through any difficulties. They'd already gotten him through the loss of Laura, and now they were here to provide whatever he needed for Noah. Sasha had no one. She rarely spoke of her father and never mentioned any friends. The only person in her life Jude knew by name was her executive assistant, James. Professional associates weren't the same as friends and family though. Your nephew is holding his own for now. Jude inhaled, invigorated by the conversation with his sister. I'll know more later today. For now, he's in an incubator, but we can touch him. How's Bailey? Janice huffed. I think this beast is going to more demanding than the baby. He's been in and out at least 15 times, and he still left a puddle in the middle of the kitchen. Thanks for taking him. Jude put the SUV into drive and pulled out of the parking lot, headed toward the cluster of high-rises that pinpointed Arlington on the horizon. I'll swing by in an hour or so to pick him up. Leave him here for now. I'm sure you'll want to spend more time at the hospital. Janice paused. I dropped off the gifts from the baby shower at your house, and there's food in the refrigerator. Just let us know what you need. Love you. Love you too. Bro, tell Sasha we're keeping all of you in our thoughts and prayers. She'll appreciate that. He took the Beltway south, got off on Arlington Road, and turned into the parking structure for Sasha's high-rise apartment. She'd texted the code for the entrance, and he made his way up to her place on the 21st floor. The key turned silently in the lock, and he fought the impulse to tiptoe through the door, feeling a bit like he was violating her privacy by entering her personal space without her. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased a westerly view that went on for miles and miles. Tall buildings sprouted amid clusters of trees just starting to take on the colors of autumn. The walls, carpet, tile, and furnishings were white, pristine shades of ivory, alabaster, and pearl that would hardly stand up to the grubby hands of an active little boy. It was a gorgeous apartment for a single career woman, but not at all suited for a single mother with a small child. Fortunately, Sasha had been willing to relocate so they lived closer to each other. It would make shared custody easier and more convenient than living 90 minutes apart. She'd purchased a home about 10 minutes from his farm outside Chantilly, but she wasn't scheduled to move in for another month. He walked through the living room to a hallway that led to the master bedroom suite and a spare bedroom Sasha had turned into a home office. The second room was jammed with boxes and packing material, with barely enough space to squeeze through. The master bedroom looked like an advertisement for upscale living. A huge mound of throw pillows topped a sage-colored comforter on a king-size 4-poster bed. He inhaled, recognizing the perfume she favored as well as the elusive scent of eucalyptus and lemon. The room was feminine without being frilly, and Jude could easily imagine Sasha lounging in bed in a pair of silk pajamas while she worked on her laptop while the city lights glittered across a dark landscape. He let the image linger in his mind until guilt gnawed its way up from his gut and shredded it into tiny pieces. Boundaries, he reminded himself. He checked his cell and began retrieving the items Sasha had asked for, tucking them into an overnight bag he found in her closet. One last check of the apartment confirmed the nagging suspicion. Clearly, she'd been waiting to move into her new place to set up the baby's bedroom. There was no way Sasha was prepared to bring Noah home. She'd also indicated at the session with Zoe that she was still tying things up at work. One of the nurses he'd spoken to at the hospital indicated Noah's hospital stay could be as long as a couple of weeks or as short as a few days. He had to meet a series of milestones before he was cleared for discharge. But late preterm babies experienced fewer complications than most preemies. Sasha's plan was falling apart. They needed to come up with something else. Jude had an idea, but he wasn't sure she was going to like it. Chapter 5. 2 weeks later, Jude settled himself in the NICU recliner and unzipped the soft fleece shirt he'd purchased especially for the kangaroo care sessions with his son, Kitty, the NICU nurse who'd helped them through so many trying moments, including a brief relapse when Noah began experiencing apnea. Undressed the baby so he wore only a diaper and placed him on Jude's bare chest. Comfortable? She asked. Jude fidgeted to find the right position, then nodded. Okay, Daddy. Snuggle time. She covered the baby with a blanket and re-zipped his shirt. Use the call button if you need anything. Jude loved these skin-on-skin sessions with Noah. The baby's sweet warmth and reassuring weight against his heart reassured him of the rightness in pursuing fatherhood, even in such an unconventional manner. The quiet, intimate connection enabled him to bond with the baby and helped him become more confident handling the tiny babe. Everything was falling into place except Sasha's housing situation. The move into her new house had been delayed yet again, causing problems when she learned she could not extend the lease on her apartment. She hired movers to put her things into storage, and reluctantly accepted her father's invitation to move back home. In addition to straightening out the logistics of her personal life, things were also chaotic at work. She'd expected at least another month to put things in order before taking time off for Noah. They were meeting with a pediatrician at 3 o'clock to discuss the baby's discharge plan. They'd agreed that Noah would spend the first week with Sasha, and then the next week with Jude. Given the complications of Noah's premature birth and Sasha's transient living arrangements, they would have to come up with something else. An idea came to him the day he's visited Sasha's apartment to pack a bag for her so she could remain at the hospital with the baby, but he decided to hold off on discussing it with her until a decision had to be made. With Noah's discharge imminent, it was time to make a proposal. Dr. Gove sat at his office desk, dressed in a pair of blue scrubs. He was tapping away at his keyboard when Sasha and Jude arrived for their appointment. "Come on in." He pushed the keyboard aside and swiveled in his chair to face them across his desk. Sasha sat on the edge of her seat, hands clasped between her knees. She crossed her ankles and took a deep breath to compose herself. She'd schooled herself never to reveal weakness, and right now she felt particularly vulnerable. Any day now, Noah would be ready to come home, and she didn't have a place for him. Work demands were pulling at her, and the stress of living with her father again was wearing on her. When she told him about Noah, he seemed to assume the father was out of the picture. When he discovered the baby's father was very much involved and that he and Sasha intentionally planned the pregnancy without benefit of a traditional relationship, he'd stared in disbelief and walked away. She'd gone into co-parenting with every contingency covered. She'd selected an ideal father figure. They'd worked with a therapist to lay the foundation for a cooperative, respect partnership. She'd purchased a spacious home in the area's best school district. She'd hired staff so she no longer had to travel 2 weeks of every month. Yet despite all of her careful preparations, it was going to hell in a handbasket. It was stressful, demoralizing, frustrating, and discouraging. But there was only one thing that mattered. Noah was getting bigger and stronger every day. Soon, he'd be ready to come home. If she had to bring him home to her father's mansion and set up a bassinet beside her bed, that's what she would do. She reminded herself the current situation was temporary. It was just a matter of time before she and her son were settled into a new home and a new life. A life that included Jude. That was another aspect of life not going according to plan. But she didn't have the bandwidth to contemplate her growing attraction and convoluted feelings. "We're anxious to hear your report, Dr. Gove." Sasha focused her attention away from Jude's reassuring presence and waited for the update on their son. "I have great news and good news," he said. "Where should I start?" "Just lay it out for us." Jude was uncharacteristically curt. Sasha wondered if he knew something she didn't. "Noah's made tremendous progress. He's gaining weight, his suck reflex is improving, and he's feeding from a nipple. My only concern is that he's still experiencing sleep apnea." "Have the nurses explained what this is?" "Yes," Jude said. "Sometimes babies stop breathing, which can cause their heart rate and oxygen levels to drop. Noah has been on an apnea monitor in the NICU, and we've heard the alarm go off a few times. He's still having occasional bouts of apnea, but most babies outgrow it in a few months. If you're comfortable learning how to use a home apnea monitor, it's called a cardiorespiratory monitor. You can take Noah home as soon as tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" Sasha blurted out. The pediatrician frowned. confused by her dismayed reaction. "I understand you and Mr. Scott have a somewhat unique arrangement. The intent is to share custody, with Noah transitioning between your homes each week. Is that correct?" "Yes, but is that a problem?" Jude interrupted. "Noah is doing well," the doctor said, "but he's still a preemie. He'll be on the apnea monitor, and he'll require feeding every 2 to 3 hours. Bringing home a preterm infant can be challenging for two parents. Managing it alone, well, Sasha felt the air leaving her chest. She'd envisioned quiet, peaceful nights rocking Noah to sleep in his Winnie the Pooh nursery and blissful days playing with him, watching him nap, and settling into motherhood. "Can we have a minute, Doctor?" Jude stood up and looked expectantly at her. "Of course. I'll have my secretary show you to the conference room. Take as much time as you need." Jude paced the length of the conference room, hands tucked into his front pockets, waiting for Sasha to return from the restroom. He hated watching her distress escalate as the doctor relayed the requirements necessary to care for Noah at home. He, at least, could call on his family for assistance. Sasha didn't have anyone. She was already stretched to a breaking point because of the delay moving into her new home and work demands. The idea that popped into his head 2 weeks ago now seemed like the ideal solution for all of them. It definitely required crossing boundaries temporarily if he could convince Sasha to agree to it. The quiet swish of the conference room door announced her return. He turned on his heel, nervous about revealing his proposal until he saw the tear stains she attempted to wash away. The long strands framing her face were dark where she'd splashed her face with water, and her eyes were red. "Sorry," she murmured. "I've been waiting for the doctor to release Noah so we could take him home, but the timing couldn't be worse." "Listen," he began once they were seated at the long wooden table. "I know what the co-parenting plan says, but we're dealing with a situation we never anticipated. I think we should flex the terms of our agreement, at least until Noah is off the apnea monitor and you are in your new place." Her face paled, and her hands, clasped atop the tabletop, started to tremble. "Everything is ready at my place. Noah can come home with me and stay until you're situated." "That could be weeks," she gasped. "Do you mean to keep him all to yourself just because She began crying in earnest. The tender feelings that goaded Jude into making his generous offer cooled like lava hitting ocean waves. Did she really think so poorly of him as to level such a horrible accusation? He regretted mentioning the idea now but knew it was the best option for Noah. "I meant for you to move in with us." Chapter 6. Jude's home was incredible. The 3-acre property included a wooden farmhouse built in 1870 and an outbuilding constructed of fieldstone that he'd converted into a stained glass art studio. The interior of the house was rustic with exposed beams, brick walls, a fieldstone fireplace, pine cabinets and stone tile. The furnishings were masculine deep leather chairs, a cowhide area rug, metallic fixtures, unfinished wooden shelving. The austerity of the decor was relieved by thick, hand-knit throws and several of Jude's stained glass pieces. This was her third evening in Jude's home. She'd apologized several times, but an awkward distance remained between them. She didn't know how to restore the open, relaxed connection they'd developed over the past year, but she was doing her best. "Dinner's ready," Jude called out from the kitchen where he'd been putting together a meal when she returned from a busy day at the office. Although there was an obvious tension when they were in the same room, they'd settled into a surprisingly comfortable routine, a pattern that felt natural and would be so easy to slip into permanently. "Be right there." She hurried to change into jeans, a sweater, and thick socks. Jude's home was a cozy haven against the chilly autumn temperatures, but the floors were cold. Jude walked around barefoot, seemingly unaffected by the icy floorboards, but she preferred socks or slippers to keep her toes warm. She padded down the stairway from the upstairs bedrooms, stomach gurgling with hunger, arms aching to hold Noah. She missed him every second she was at the office, but not as much as she had when he was in the hospital. Knowing he was with Jude eased her anxieties so she could focus on work. "Who's coming over for dinner tonight?" she asked, peeking into the baby carrier securely propped at one of the long living room sofa. It was close enough to the kitchen to hear the baby if he cried, but far enough that the light and activity didn't bother him if he dozed off. She caressed her son's downy cheek with the back of her finger. A brief reflex smile creased his face, making her heart thump. "It's just us." Jude stirred a wooden spoon around a large pot from which a savory scent wafted. "I prepared a traditional Scot recipe, a little something we call hearty hamburger soup." "Sounds good," she said, encouraged by Jude's engaging behavior. "What can I do to help?" "Set the table, if you don't mind." His tone was friendly although he had yet to look at her. "You know where everything is?" "I'm learning," she said. "How was Noah today?" "Good. The monitor didn't go off once, and Janice got him to take an extra ounce this morning." "It's nice that your family is willing to help out." She arranged bowls, plates, silverware, napkins, and glasses at one end of the trestle table situated at one end of the kitchen area. "You say that like they're doing us a favor." He chuckled. "My sisters and sis-in-laws are ticked off at Janice and my mom because they won't let anyone else come over. Janice told them the doctor said we had to limit germs so only 2 people can visit until Noah is older." "I'd love to be a part of your family," she admitted. Jude turned from the stove and locked eyes with her. "We can make that happen," he said. "I'm falling in love with you, Sasha." "I'm already there," she whispered. "Marry me. Let's make our family the real thing." She kissed him until Noah began crying, reminding them what started it all. Thank you so much for listening to The Single Dad and the Career Girl. If you enjoyed this sexy, sassy novella, please hit on the subscribe button. That would mean more than you know.